All right.
Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone for joining us again, like every month. So this is the event to think about what intelligence is all about and what parts of science can help answer those questions about what mechanisms and algorithms it encompasses. Yeah, this is organized by Cross Labs, which is a research institute, a sort of new kind of university within the industry. And you can check out all the details on crosslabs.org. I might as well enter the URL here in a second. But what we do is we distill knowledge from disciplines of mind, brain science, mathematics, information dynamics, anything AI related, neural nets, but also cognition and artificial life. Yeah, our purpose is that we make a difference in society directly. Welcome everyone to this event, which is called Crossroads, another cross thingy. That's a public event. So everybody, please join also our link that I posted earlier on YouTube and in the chat here on Zoom. You can join us on Zoom directly. We're testing new things today. And I guess I thank also everyone at the tech company that co-organizes this and funds us and founded us, which is Cross Compass, and Antoine Pasquali, Katsunobu Suzuki, and everyone at the company. In particular, Stephen Wei and Yasmin Morel, who are participating in backstage here, helped a lot for the event and the promotion. And tonight, I have the pleasure to introduce Michael Muthukrishna. He's an associate professor of economic psychology at the LSE, London School of Economics. He's also an associate of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology. I'm going to read now at Harvard University, and affiliate of the Developmental Economics Group at STICERD. And technical director of the database of religious history. A very interdisciplinary background here. And yeah, he's, in his own words on Twitter, researching and spreading the word on how humans evolved and what that means for us today. So that's research on processes from, I guess, psychology and evolutionary dynamics, also cultural dynamics, and he will be touching on that tonight, I guess, introducing the science of cultural evolution and how this can explain some of the puzzles in human intelligence. So everybody feel free to ask questions on Slido. As always, I will post the link right here in the chat. And yeah, Michael, yeah, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. So let me just share this. All right. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Olaf. If anyone wants to turn their videos on, they can. I like to see the feedback so I know when to start, speed up or slow down. So I misunderstood Olaf a little bit. I thought that this was a very short presentation, only 15 minutes. And so what I'm going to do, since I made it, but I actually have 30 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of put in a few more things. But the purpose here is really to give a very, very broad strokes overview of both cultural evolution and then how that might speak to human intelligence in particular, to open up discussion where we can, get into the deep and dirty details. So in some work, I've argued that basically cultural evolution as part of this broader framework, dual inheritance theory, represents the closest that we've come to some kind of formal theory of human behavior. And I've been a big advocate of using theoretical frameworks as a way to organize an otherwise disorganized world, a disorganized science. So I think of dual inheritance theory, this idea that we are a new kind of animal that doesn't just have our short lifetime of experience guiding our behavior, and not just the instincts that we get genetically from our parents, but also this kind of intermediate cultural package that we receive from our societies. So, when most animals encounter a new environment, they're forced to genetically adapt to that environment. For in fact, to deal with a cold, faster muscles to catch up with, to escape predators, let's say. proteins to detoxify foods and remove poisons from plants. But we marched across the globe, hunting or gathering our way to lush rainforests and dry deserts and a wide array of environments. And we did it mostly, we did change a little bit genetically, as I'll discuss in a moment, but mostly culturally. So we figured out how to detoxify the foods culturally, the processes that we could do this in. We didn't just like escape our predators. We hunted predators and prey and wore their skin as a way to kind of keep warm instead of developing too much fur and fat. So dual inheritance theory serves as as the equivalent, I think, of like natural selection for biology, or the periodic table for chemistry, a way that moves us from alchemy to chemistry. So no longer are we trying to turn lead into gold, because that doesn't make sense according to the theoretical framework. We can focus in on the things that do make sense and try to make some order to it. So I discussed that in this paper. If you want a very brief overview to cultural evolution, Joe Henrik and Maciek Szudek and I also wrote this chapter in the Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology, and I recommend it. Okay, so the starting point for understanding cultural evolution is a fairly innocuous question. Why are humans so different to other animals? We're, of course, very similar to other animals in many ways, but what is it that makes us different? Because we are in some substantial ways. And when I pose this question to my students, they list all kinds of very sensible things, right? They say, it's our sense of humor, it's our technology, it's our memory, and so on. But I think underlying this list is this very obvious and therefore unstated assumption, and it's that humans are just smarter, right? We have these giant brains that make us more intelligent than other animals, and that's really the secret of our success. We've marched across the globe and used these giant brains to figure out how to operate in every environment available. Sometimes what it takes for science to move forward is to let go of assumptions, and I think one of the assumptions that kind of holds back the human sciences is this assumption that we are that much more brilliant, or at least we're brilliant in ways that mimic what's going on with other animals. Okay, so there have been various attempts to suggest that the chimps are quite brilliant, as one example, right? So we'd like to use control groups in science, and we can't rerun the human experiments, so we often use chimps as a proxy. And initially, there were some claims that chimps have better working memory than we do. And I'll discuss that in a second, and that they even play certain games, certain economic games, closer to the Nash equilibrium when humans don't. Now, there's this bias in science, right? You don't get published when you say that babies are stupid. You get published when you say, look at how clever babies are. You don't get published when you say animals are stupid and adult humans are clever. You get published when you say that adult humans are stupid and animals are very clever. And I think this kind of work has that flavor to it. But I think it's very interesting because it even though there are debates around this, which I'll discuss in a moment, it reveals something about it reveals something about the gap, let's say, between us and our closest relatives, right? So to kind of illustrate this, I like to show this video of a working memory game with a very highly trained chimp, Ayumu. Has anybody seen this video before? I'm sure many of you have. Let's just play it anyway for the audience who haven't. So it's a working memory game, and I'd like you to play against the chimp. So what will happen is, a series of numbers are going to appear on the screen, and then they're going to get covered very quickly with squares. And your job is to kind of remember their location and then press them in order. You guys ready? Okay. How'd you go? So when this paper first came out, as you'll see from the title here, it was pitched as kind of this working memory test. The chimps had this brilliant amount of working memory, And, as it turns out, it doesn't seem to be the case. And so then people thought, well, maybe chimps just have amazing iconic memory. So the sensory memory, they just quickly perceive those numbers and then can kind of press them in order. But, more recent work suggests that actually, if you train humans well enough, they can do that too, right? They can, they can do this, and probably with more numbers. But I think this debate about, what's going on with the chimp and what's going on with humans obscures something that isn't so obvious, and that is that the gap between us and our closest relatives isn't quite as large as a lot of people, will first assume. And the ways in which our brains operate, like whether we are kind of a scaled up primate brain or have something brand new, is a very, very important question, right? Because it speaks to what is at the core of intelligence. Whenever we think about intelligence, we're looking for this thing that is inside us, this kind of G, this general intelligence that guides everything else. And then when we want to measure it, we want to look for these core processing. Is it our working memory capacity? Is it, our reaction time? What exactly is this thing? And I think whenever you look for these things, you get results that chimps are quite impressive, actually, although they have brains a third of the size of ours. There's some evidence that, reaction time, if anything, has an anti-Flint effect. That is, it's been going up over generations, although you can see massive spread in this paper. What I think is true, regardless of what is driving it, is that humans are thoroughly impressive, right? We do things like this and this, while, they, to quote Bennett Galef, kind of sit naked in the rain. The core of, I guess, this question is, how is it that we're doing this? What does it mean for us to be intelligent? And the answer that I'd like to propose, that I think fits most of the evidence, is that we have the second line of inheritance, culture, and it operates as an evolutionary line of inheritance. That is, it is changing over time beyond our conscious awareness. So the idea is that humans are this new kind of animal. We have a genetic inheritance that we get from our parents, but also this cultural inheritance that we get from our societies. And really, it's this cultural inheritance, the interplay between genes and culture, that make us so unique, that has led to our success. Now, any evolutionary system, whether it's a genetic system, whether it's a cultural system, or a genetic algorithm, requires three basic ingredients, right? You need variation, you need transmission, and you don't want to lose too much information along the way, and you need that transmission to be selective. You can have an evolutionary system without selection, but it wouldn't be adaptive. So you have to reduce the number of things that don't work and increase the number of things that do. So when it comes to genetic evolution, I think most people are familiar with how that works. For cultural evolution, the variation bit, I think, is fairly easy, right? People do all kinds of things for all kinds of reasons. We have individual variation in personality, for example. There are genetic differences between us. We make mistakes when we're learning. We don't get things quite right. We have differential access to information and so on, right? I think the key to humans and what makes us so interesting is what's going on with the transmission, where it seems to be high fidelity in some way. In order for an evolutionary system to work, that information has to be transmitted generation by generation without too much loss, either at an individual level or at a population level. And it needs to be selective. And so it seems that we have a whole bunch of biases that allow us to hone in on who's got the adaptive knowledge. A skill bias, success bias, a prestige bias. And when everybody's copying from these very successful people who seem to be doing things that are working well, then the population as a whole is worth copying. And so we can begin to conform to the majority of people in general. We're not blind in either our high fidelity transmission or in these selective biases. We, for example, have self-relevance cues. We will tend to copy people who are like us, who are in our groups. We're not stupid. So we do look to see if the information is credible in some way. So we pay attention to cues that would be costly if they were false, what are called creds, credibility enhancing displays, or other kinds of sincerity cues. And not all information is equally valuable. There are evolved biases toward information that is socially relevant for reputations, evolved biases toward dangerous things that might harm us, and so on. There are content biases. So a whole bunch of things, and a lot of cultural evolution is focused in on these. For those, I can see in the audience many people who are familiar with cultural evolution, but for those who are not, the starting point is this social learning, right? And it goes all the way back to Boyd and Richardson's work and Cavelli, Schwartz, and Felsman's work back in the 1980s, asking the question of when would any animals or, its genetic instincts, right? And their model suggests that there's this kind of Goldilocks zone that matches up with environmental variability. Specifically kind of this autocorrelation, perhaps when it matches generation length. So what does that mean? So if the environment is highly stable, then a genetic solution is the most efficient way to solve that problem, right? You don't have to think about it. So human skin color is a nice example of this. So on average, of course, there's seasonal variation, but latitude is a pretty good predictor of the amount of UV radiation that's available. And human skin color does this optimization exercise where you don't want so much that you're at risk of skin cancer, and you don't want so little that you're vitamin D deficient and at risk of other cancers. It's not that the lag on that is so long that you couldn't really learn it in your lifespan, how much time I should spend in the sun. And even culturally, it's not as efficient as just changing the genes associated with that. If the environment is highly unstable, so, today, there's a drought, tomorrow there's no drought, today the berries are here, tomorrow it's there, the water's here, and so on. Then, this is actually a really difficult problem for genetic evolution to solve. And so instead, we might see a trial and error. So genes might select for trial and error learning, very large brains, because I need to figure out, this stuff. My genes can't guide me because the environment has changed, and the information of the people around me is probably out of date. So in between these two extremes, we see this kind of Goldilocks zone of intermediate variability where your parents and grandparents actually have some knowledge worth paying attention to, right? So as a stylized example, imagine kind of a cyclical drought. You've never experienced it. Maybe your parents have, or maybe even they haven't. But grandma remembers the drought that she experienced when she was a child. And so she can lead the tribe left of the forest past the mountain to a water source, right? When the environment is moderately stable, and if this matches up with generation length, then your parents and grandparents actually have some knowledge worth paying attention to. Now, if you're paying attention, this should, in principle, lead to social learning across the animal kingdom. So there must be something more for it to be special for humans. But nonetheless, we do see this validated when it comes to new data is emerging, of course, but the initial data suggests that actually, yes, exactly when we see this transition, we get this kind of period of moderate stability. But social learning can't be enough. Like, it can't be just that it's social learning. It is widespread across the animal kingdom. And clearly, it's not enough for an evolutionary system to take off. We need something that maintains this information generation to generation. It needs to be able to kind of exceed your own capacity to causally understand what it is that you're doing. So one nice example that illustrates this high fidelity learning is an experiment by Victoria Horner and Andy Whiten, where they give children and chimps, our control group, this box that they call, like a magical fruit. And it's got this hole in the top, which you can see here. And it's got a hole on the side, which you can see here. And inside is a reward for the chimps and a reward for the children. So a piece of fruit for the chimps and a sticker for the children. And so the experimenter demonstrates by, poking their hole through the top, poking their hole through the side, and lo and behold, it accesses the fruit for the chimps and accesses the sticker for the children. So they hand it to the chimp. What does the chimp do? Pokes the hole to the top, pokes the hole to the side, gets its reward. Hand it to the children. What do the children do? Poke the hole to the top, poke the hole to the side, get their reward. Then in the key variation, they introduce a new box, which is identical to the first box, but is now transparent, right? So now you can see that first action doesn't do anything because there's this kind of ceiling here, where if you kind of try to poke through it, it actually doesn't. It's only the second action that retrieves the reward. But again, the experimenter pokes their hole through the top, pokes their hole through the side, and hands it to the chimp. What does the chimp do? Chimps are clever. They're like, forget that first action, obviously does nothing. They go straight to the side hole, retrieve the reward. They're emulating, as scientists call it. They do the same thing, hand the box to the children. What do the children do? Poke their hole through the top, poke their hole through the side, right? Now, there's two things that ought to be said here. First is that children are not complete idiots when it comes to these things. Like, subsequent experiments suggest that they're cueing into whether the demonstrator actually knows what they're doing. They're doing it for a reason that can be understood, or it's just part of it. Maybe I'll figure this thing out later, right? So there are these experiments by Gergely, for example, where, again, you get this over-imitation where the adult will press a light switch with their head, and they're either covering themselves with a blanket, which means that their hands are no longer free, or their hands are completely free, and they hit it with their head anyway. And the kids will copy it when they hit it with their head and their hands are free, because there must be a reason, because otherwise they would have hit it with their hands, right? But through this kind of learning, this kind of partial causal model learning, we acquire a whole bunch of recipes that we use throughout our lives. And it's kind of masked by this illusion of explanatory depth. So when we cook, for example, We salt the meat a certain way at the beginning or the end. We cut the meat a certain way, not because we really understand the chemistry or the biology of cooking. This is how it was demonstrated to us by, our parents or Gordon Ramsay or whoever you're paying attention to, right? You use a computer that may as well be magic to you, but you know that, if you press this button, it'll reset the wireless, whatever that means. And, if you press this sequence of buttons, you get to your emails, which are overfull. And so we have many of these recipes, and I think what masks the realization that this is really what's going on, this kind of copying, is that we also have this illusion of explanatory depth. So we have this tendency to believe that we possess causal models for things that we don't really. So if you ask people, how does a flushing toilet work? People have, I kind of understand how a flushing toilet works, centuries old technology. I interact with it every day, fingers crossed. But really, if you ask people further and deeper questions like, how does the water take everything away and then kind of return to the same level, they realize the limits of their knowledge. Or, as another two examples that I often use are, why does a wine bottle have a punt on the bottom? Why should you finish your course of antibiotics? Everyone has an answer for that. It's to, prevent superbugs. But surely finishing the course of antibiotics, since not every germ is going to get killed, not every bacteria is going to get killed, surely that only selects for the most antibacterial resistant bacteria, right? Anyway, life is far more complicated than our psychology allows us to believe. We're not just copying at random, we are copying selectively. So we're honing in on who's got the knowledge. And there's a whole host of biases that I could get into, but I'll tell you a quick story to illustrate this, how this thing might evolve. So if you imagine kind of, Bruce, this great hunter in days gone by, Bruce is amazing, right? He goes out, he collects the most meat, he's got the biggest house. All the little hunters want to be like Bruce, but they don't know exactly what it is that makes Bruce so successful. So they're honing in on the fact that he is successful, but they don't know what it is. They've got partial causal models, like, maybe it's where he's hunting or the time of day or the weapons he's using or whatever, but they don't have physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, economics, none of these things. So the best thing that they can do is copy this, because it could be all of those plausible things, but it could also be the shoes that he's wearing, or his his crazy beard, or the way he shaves his head, or the gods he's worshiping. So the best thing that a little hunter can do is just copy as many things as they can about Bruce and hope for the best. And of course, that psychology is still with us today. I mean, it's why celebrities can endorse things and people will increase their consumption of Coke because Taylor Swift says that it's her drink, even though obviously that drink has nothing to do with her success or her talent, or Kim Kardashian and data plans. She might know something about that, actually. Okay, so I've done the opposite of what I wanted. I'm going a little overtime. So this is, this leads to the second line of inheritance, this cultural evolution, right? And this second line can lead to runaway effects that have shaped our species in a variety of ways. So the cultural brain hypothesis is one particular model that describes how this can lead to that runaway effect where our brains triple in size, so we're 3 times as large as a chimp. We are this kind of scaled up primate brain, the evidence seems to suggest. So brains are not, there are various explanations for this. One explanation is that brains are for social things, the social brain hypothesis. You would think that matches up with cultural evolution, but actually I think brains are far more general than that. They are for storing and managing and using information. If you want a pithy, description of intelligence, it's predicting, running a simulation of our world and minimizing the error of that simulation against what you actually see. And one way to do that is with more of this adaptive knowledge. And as the knowledge began to accumulate through these cultural evolutionary processes, it put a selection pressure for larger and larger brains, which in turn allowed for more adaptive knowledge. And if you are acquiring that knowledge socially, it means that larger groups actually have more knowledge that you can learn. So you should get better at social learning, more reliant on social learning, and you can expand your group size. So you get this kind of co-evolutionary process between these 4 things. At some point, you hit this limit on the size of the brain that you can birth. And so you start to push on other things. So one of the things you can do is to start to extend your juvenile period to just give you more time to learn, right? We are now in this world of kind of a cultural adolescence. So if you treat adolescence as the period from when you can reproduce and when you actually do, and think back to when you could have reproduced and whether you actually did or when you actually did, that period has been extending. So we no longer hit this kind of genetic limit on how large a brain you can birth, but how late in life you can actually give birth to a baby. And you start to get better at who to learn from and where to gather this information. And humans are kind of taken off on this co-evolutionary process. And we're constantly trying to figure out ways to pack in more of this information. So one of the ways was to just grow our brain to the point where they're difficult to birth. Here's an orang, here's chimps, here's gorillas. This is your head size. This is the birth canal. You can see, stylized. This is a vast difference. It's very difficult for us. As another example, this is out of the medical literature. This is Lipschitz 2015. So, we used to think that big babies were difficult to birth. It turns out it's big heads that are difficult to birth. That selection, like there's enough variation in our population, and that selection pressure must, I assume, still be there, that, once you hit about the 85th percentile for brain size, this is emergency birth interventions on the y-axis, right? So these are unplanned cesareans, unplanned instrumental births. It just takes off like a hockey stick. What cesareans are doing is a fascinating thing. Ask me in the discussion if you want to hear some of my thoughts on that. But one of the major ways that we dealt with this is also just by dividing up the information. So if you imagine, again, in this kind of stylized model, you max out of this 10 size brain. There are 10 things that you need to do to survive. You need to avoid predators, process food, build a shelter, get some clothing, find a mate, learn the laws, whatever. There's 10 things you need to do, 10 size brain. All of us reach skill level 1, right? But if your population is large enough, then you can begin to farm out at some of the information. Even if people die, you can reliably know that, let's say 50% of the information can be handled by others. Now you personally can hit skill level 2 on 5 of those traits. And as a society, our mean skill level is 2, right? Further specialization allows you to go even further. So if I only have to learn one of those things, I'm just going to be a house builder, then I can build some pretty impressive houses with my brain. I can get to a 10 size skill level. We see this, so in a small town, you might have one general physician. In New York, you might have, one doctor who specializes on just the renal system and maybe one small part of that, right? And that specialization allows you to really get very, very good at one small thing, even if it makes you pretty useless in everything else. So we have this kind of collective brain where a lot of our computation starts to happen at a societal level. So intelligence, how does this all this play out? Intelligence, of course, does have this kind of genetic component to it, right? There is an element to the quality of your brain based on not just your genes, but also, whether there was lead in your environment, the amount of pollution in your environment, whether your mom was smoking or you were surrounded by smoking when you were a child, how much nutrition you're getting. All of these things go into building a quality brain, right? But a large amount of the differences that we see across history and between societies is this kind of software element. So it's not just the hardware, it's the software, right? And it's hard to see this because, we always worry about, am I in a bubble? Am I surrounded by other liberals where I can't imagine, anyone voting for Brexit or anyone voting for Trump or, pick your favorite thing. We live in a bubble that is thoroughly educated, where all of us have very similar kind of cultural input. Our friends all had cultural input. Our friends' parents had similar cultural input. We have a formal education system to deliver this information to us, right? It's masked. And it's almost hard to believe that any other societies might not be there. That something like reason, rationality might not be a human universal, but might actually be specific to the way that we educate it, which also opens up possibilities of what else we could be doing. So what is the take home for cultural evolution? Animals can do very impressive things, but almost everything they're doing is a little bit of individual learning, a little bit of social learning, but a lot, of genetic evolution. So here's the weaver. I stole this from Joe Henrich's excellent book, The Secret of Our Success. Humans can also do very impressive things, and that impressiveness has been going up over time. But we were born into a world, right, where our guts are too short and our jaws too weak to handle raw food, but we have no instincts for cooking or fire making, as you ask any college student, right? We're born into a world assuming that information is there. We're assuming that there's a whole bunch of stuff that I could learn. And we basically spend the first, 20 to now 30 years catching up on the last several thousand years of human history. All right, let's talk about intelligence. What is intelligence? We'll save it for the discussion. I gave you kind of the brief explanation. A lot of intelligence testing for humans is wrapped up in IQ, the intelligence quotient. IQ is a fantastic predictor, despite what others might say. It's a great predictor of school and work performance, at least in weird societies, so Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies. IQ differs in its predictive power. It's the least predictive of performance on tasks that demand low cognitive skill and jobs that are as classed as low information processing. It may be separable into kind of crystallized and fluid intelligence. So in other words, there is this component that's supposedly crystallized, so the stuff that you learn, your vocabulary, for example, and fluid intelligence, like how you think about problems. Crystallized intelligence may even go down over the lifespan, but fluid intelligence might actually go down over the lifespan, but crystallized intelligence will continue to grow as you learn more. There may be a general intelligence that underlies this, some component, certainly comes out in factor analyses. IQ appears to be heritable, around 50%, but heritability scores may be weaker for low SES individuals, at least in the United States, perhaps not in other places. Education seems to be able to improve IQ. IQ test scores have been increasing over time, the so-called Flint Effect, and IQ differences of neural correlates, right? These are some facts. And I think that dual inheritance theory and cultural evolution helps us make sense of this whole thing. Why is IQ a good test of school and work performance in weird societies? Because it's measuring things that there has been kind of a reduction in cognitive diversity, a global weirding. And we are measuring things that we find very important in our society, things that lead to success in our society. And even those things have been changing over time, right? So once upon a time, storing a lot of information in your head, maybe, I don't know, memorizing the holy books or becoming a doctor or a lawyer and just storing all this stuff in your head was what was most important. Today, let's say in the last 10 to 20 years, information is at our fingertips, right? We have one of these that we carry in our pockets. And a lot of the shift has been on, can I focus in an information dense world? Do I have the attention span? So these other traits that have been changing. But certainly when you look over the vast amount of history, what matters has shifted. IQ differs in its predictive power and is the least predictive. Well, I mean, that fits very nicely, right? So it's the things that we find most intellectual that our IQ tests, there's a circularity to it, will be very good at measuring. IQ may be separable into crystallized and fluid intelligence. Here's the thing. With fluid intelligence, we store a bunch of tools that we acquire from our societies, and they make us very good at thinking. Once you have intuitions for calculus or game theory, it shapes the way you think, right? So the crystallized stuff, the stuff you learn, is much deeper than that. And you don't really see that until you look back maybe to chimps or maybe just to smaller scale societies. And then you start to see that not all societies have a number system. Many societies count 1, 2, 3, many. But once you have a number system, you can count anything, right? Logical reasoning, I'll show you an example in a second, is another one of those things. IQ appears to be heritable, but heritability scores, let me dive into that one, and I'm going to dive into each of the others in more detail. Heritability. Can I keep going, Olaf? Is that okay?
Sure. Well, I won't stop you if you have more things to say.
Okay, I'll try to zip through this because I know I'm running a little over time. I shouldn't have tried to fill in the gaps. Anyway, heritability. Predicting heritability, I mean, predicting anything actually, is a function of how much variation there is in the thing you're going to predict. You know, we're all aware of things like restriction and range, how much variation and there is in the predictors, and of course the causal relationships between things, right? And when it comes to predicting heritability, there is of course the variability in the trait, you know, whatever, let's say IQ. There's variability in genes, right, within populations. And there's also a variability in the cultural input. But here's the thing. In Western societies, in weird societies, we have squashed a whole bunch of this cultural variation, right? The difference between schools is not as large as it is between no schools and some schools, right? We have solved, like most of our history was spent searching for food, but we produce a surplus of calories, enough to feed the whole world, right? Nutrition is mostly taken care of. We have squashed pollution. We do not live in a world full of disease anymore. We have, you know, medical science and so on. We've squashed this variation. And so really the only thing left to predict, you know, variation in IQ in our societies is the genes, right? That is what's in a perfectly equal world, a world in which, you know, we all had the same resources, access to the same things. Genetic heritability would be something close to 100%. Which is why I think, you know, in this is Turkheimer's result, in the United States, low SES individuals have much lower heritability scores than do high SES, because at the high SES, the difference between elite school A and elite school B is it's marginal differences compared to low SES individuals who, you know, through chance, like a school lottery, end up in a much better environment, right? And so the environmental component becomes much larger. This is obvious. This is an obvious fact that any, you know, behavioral geneticist is aware of. It's gene-environment interactions. The key is that cultural evolution is systematically shaping this cultural component in ways that can be understood. When an innovation emerges, it creates variation, inequality, and then over time it kind of squashes this. And there is a pattern to this that we can begin to understand. The second thing is that the variability, right, itself in the genes may be different in different societies. So having a disease, having a gene that protects you from malaria might be positively related to IQ in an environment that actually has malaria, but negatively or neutral in an environment that does not. A gene that helps with nutritional uptake is beneficial in an environment that has low nutrition, right? The genes for executive function, memory, attention, whatever, any unknown things will vary depending on what the environment looks like. Okay, this is just a stylized example, in a high SES. By the way, it doesn't matter whether it's high SES or low SES. What matters is how much equality there is culturally. So you can have high heritability even if everyone is in a terrible situation, right? But the transition will vary the heritability scores, where heritability is not this property of a gene or a trait that you're out there searching for. It is a moving target that depends on these cultural evolutionary forces because they're moving much faster than genetic evolutionary forces. It's when you see this variation that heritability becomes low. And so when we look at heritability scores in places like Europe or Australia, that difference disappears. You're no longer seeing differences between high SES and low SES because there is more equality. There's a standardized schooling system, and most schools are well funded. Education. So there's this emerging body of work that links education to IQ. So education seems to be a major way in which culture is transmitted, right? In small scale societies, hunter-gatherer societies, you don't see a lot of education. It's kind of let the kids hang around and they'll learn vicariously. In pastoralist, let's say chiefdoms, we see a little bit more education because there's just more stuff to learn. In our society, with the Industrial Revolution, not only did we already have formal schools, but we made them compulsory. We're like, sit down, we're going to have to deliver this package of knowledge as quickly and efficiently as possible. Phonemes, numbers, let's go. And despite this, despite this enormous reduction in variation, because we're all receiving very similar schooling, when you see things like an educational reform that for effectively random reasons increases the amount of schooling, we see this leap in IQ over time. Between the two cohorts. So you get this kind of natural experiment. Stuart Ritchie and Elliot Tucker-Drob have this very nice meta-analysis, which again, shows this overall effect of policy shifts in education and how they affect IQ points. This is this is an active area of research for me. So this is unpublished data that comes from Helen Davis's work. So here we've been looking at natural experiments. I'll save it for the discussion what that looks like, where there is a difference between no school or very little school and some school. We re-norm IQ tests by age. That's why they were invented. That's what an intelligence quotient is, because we assume kids get smarter over time. But of course, age is perfectly correlated with education in our society. In a society or in a place where you get basically no education over time, performance on Ravens-colored progressive matrices is basically flat. If you have moderate education, you see kind of a moderate slope. If you have, high quality education, you see the same kind of slope that we see in our society, right? Which again speaks to this kind of software component of what's driving this. This is another bit of work. So it's a replication of some work done by Alexander Luria in the 1920s using logical reasoning tests. So I mean, the reasoning animal, right? The rational animal. These logical tests take the form of if P then Q statements. So Luria found some results that seemed bizarre. So he was in Kazakhstan looking at an educational transition that was taking place. He asked people simple questions to kind of get started and said, where it snows, the bears are white. It snows in Siberia. What color are the bears? Any kid in our society will answer that question. Anyone with education in Kazakhstan answered that question. Those without education answered it with something like, I have no idea. I've never been to Siberia. Or probably brown. I've seen brown bears, right? It's 1920s. God only knows what Luria was doing. So we tried to replicate this experiment at one of our natural experiments. So this is some of the pilot data. We asked people questions exactly like this. I have a boat from another place. In that place, boats are made of sand. I've got one of these boats. What's it made out of? Anyone with education would say it's made out of sand. Without education, people are like, I don't know, probably wood. Who knows? This is in two different sites, same result, so massive that even in our small pilot samples, we see this, right? A lot of what we assume is a human universal is just masked by the fact that everyone has it. It's not necessarily something that, we got when we diverged from chimps. So what does that mean for the Flint effect? It's unlikely to be driven by much other than kind of these cultural differences, right? You can see it in kind of TV shows. This is something that Steve Johnson has mentioned. You can see how it's not just our education systems that are changing, but society itself. You can see it in our media. Consider, I Love Lucy versus Rick and Morty, the complexity of the shows we watch. Adam West Batman versus The Dark Knight. Christopher Reeve Superman versus Avengers Endgame. Are there neural correlates to IQ? Of course there are, but that shouldn't surprise anyone. Culture is as biological as genes are, right? culture is biological, and you should not be surprised, as I tell my students, that any aspect of our psychology is found in the brain. You should be surprised if it's found in the spleen. Okay, take home. If you want to understand human intelligence, it's not just the hardware. You can't just focus on what's going on in this impressive bit of hardware where so much of the focus has been. You also need to understand the software. You need to understand the interplay between these two things. I said all kinds of controversial things, so come at me.
All right. Yeah, so thank you so much. Maybe we can unmute ourselves to give you a round of applause for your talk.
Should I stop the screen share?
We can do the indeed the the sign language applause. Thank you so much for a very dense talk. You didn't show as many plots as I've seen in your papers. And
you told me to make it high level. You said go for a TED talk.
That's right. But you also gave a few topics for us to debate about, like very controversial points. So maybe we can bring up the if you share your screen, if you share the what is it, the Slido. So I think I posted.
You want me to share the Slido?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah. So you can also, if you want, if you have to show a slide or something, you can still do it.
Sorry, I'm confused. Do you want me to show the questions, or do you want me to show my slides?
No, the questions.
Okay.
So that's the link that wall. That's
this is what you mean. Oh, sorry. Hang on.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So yeah, I saw it for a split second.
Okay. Yep.
And I guess yeah, either.
There's only one question.
Yeah, there's only one question for now. Well, if people want to ask a question, they can also raise their hands or show the camera or post something in the chat on Zoom as well. Why don't we answer that first question?
Yeah. So I mean, it's all relative, right? So the what I mean is, when we've squashed social variability, I mean, in the context of all of the ways that society can vary, all of the ways that cognition can vary across human history and across the globe, weird societies are far shrunk relative to that. Does that mean that there is an inequality in our society? Of course not. And does it not mean that inequality varies between weird societies? Of course not. There is still variability, but it's a matter of how much variability. So I think that is what is masked: the degree to which humans don't think like philosophers, let's say. And if you draw, so here's one of the problems. So one of my critiques of the way psychology operates is a lot of what we do is folk reasoning. We look to our own lives and those around us and we say, how does this thing work? Assuming that that's how it always works, always has worked. And I think that systematically misleads us, because we don't look like most humans have over most of history, and we don't look like most of the globe do today.
Mm-hmm. I guess this is also a difficult thing to measure. What do you use as indicators of variability? Do you think there are things that you might be missing, or how does that, how to best capture that?
Are you talking about the second question?
No, still the same. I guess the same point about variability.
Like how are things shifting?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, this, I think, you can see it, I guess, looking at kind of the anthropological record. So Joe Henrich is well known for kind of popularizing the visual illusion difference. So the Mueller-Lyer effect doesn't seem to replicate very well across societies. That is very old work that was kind of discovered in the 1960s, and there is all of this work on what small-scale societies do and how they think and so on. I have a weird kind of life history as well. I mean, I grew up in Botswana and Papua New Guinea and Sri Lanka. And so, I mean, as a kid, I remember meeting the Kung San. And if you talk to people, like if you actually talk to people with and without education, it's a very different world. It's a very different way of thinking, very different bit of cognition. We are heavily shaped by that. The best way I try to convey that to people is think about the small amount of variation you do see and how your friends think very similarly, and trying to convey academic concepts or logical reasoning or logical fallacies to people who don't think about that. Right? It's crazy, that gap there. Now imagine how much more that is if they didn't even have some of the basic building blocks. Right? That's I guess the point. So human reasoning is heavily driven by these tools for thinking, this software that's running on our brain, numbers, logical reasoning, how to focus and sit down and do one thing, how to make connections, abstracting concepts out, thinking with categories, all of these things that they're not universal. Yeah. Colors is another nice example, right? Like just as something that people can understand. Once you have a name for it, so our brains don't work like computers. They work more like simulators, if you like. They build a world, and when our simulations are violated, dorsal anterior cingulate cortex fires off and says something's broken, try to fix it, right? You walk up to a door, you're not like rectangular object, handle, oh, that's a door. It's more like you're expecting it. And if if something doesn't work, you try to push it, it should be a pull, your expectations are violated. Colors are an example of that. So, if we have green and light green, let's say, and then we have red and we have pink. We don't call it light red. But the mere fact that you have pink as a category means that when you see someone wearing pink, you're more likely to store that in your abstract category. And when you reconstruct it, you have a thing to reconstruct it with. You wouldn't reconstruct it quite so well if it was just like it's a shade of green, because we don't store that information like a camera. We store it in these abstract categories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess there is this phenomenon of how we model the world that is distinct from obviously the world itself. But it's when we talk about culture, it means that we also share in some kind of communication protocol with other agents that make that are part of our cultural group.
That's right.
And we agree on it to an extent, and you have a sort of diversity, still variability within that. And I wonder, I guess you have a sort of that's the storage we're talking about here when we talk about dual inheritance models, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, culture is like, it's like a fish in water. You don't notice it till you're out of the water. You don't notice what is cultural till you speak to someone outside your culture. And I think this is an issue with foreign policy. You assume that everybody wants freedom, or that a lot of people just want to feed their kids, and they don't care about what the government's doing, right? And so when you try to transplant democracy to places that don't have the norms that co-evolved with our liberal democracies, they're not always successful.
And before we jump to the next question, I remember from a few years back when I was doing this kind of research on cultural evolution, just a small part of it, I guess. A colleague of mine was working on the two-stage replicator models of cultural evolution. How, if you have a dish, you also have a recipe, and it has a stage where it's cooked and you're guessing the ingredients, you're trying to make the same dish, but at the same time you can read the recipe or write the recipe. And those are two stages in which the same element of culture can be memorized, right? And you can have more than two. And I wonder how much research there is on that, on the transfer of information between basically different models, different levels of memory in culture. And how those kind of transfers, if they transfer really fast or with a lot of loss, you could have very different dynamics for certain objects, and certain different ones you would have, you wouldn't have the same variability and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to that. In some of the transmission experiments, actually, I see that Matthew Charbonneau is here, so he might know the answer to that. I know in some of the transmission experiments, when you have the model as well as the steps, that works out better. In the education literature, in pedagogy, starting at the beginning and at the end can be very helpful. So we often have this tendency, I mean, like math, right? We teach it in the order that it was discovered. Start with the Greeks and work your way upward. But often, like if you show kids the end product and show them how it's used, and then build up these things that kind of have the two merge in the middle, that can be pedagogically useful. I don't know beyond that specifically, how we store I think what you mean is kind of the reverse engineering the end product versus like understanding the first principles or following a recipe. There's a lot, should I be answering these questions as well, Olaf?
Yeah, let's start with top question. Yeah, so maybe I'll read it and you respond. Let's do that. I don't understand. Is the point of the talk that IQ equals intelligence? Could there be a factor where societies are educating people towards skills asked by IQ tests? That's a general question.
Yeah. So no, I don't think that IQ is intelligence, but I don't know. Outside of a very general idea of systems that are adapting themselves, and so I sometimes think about this as kind of like control systems with some kind of memory, and the lag and the delay on these control systems, and the storage of the memory, or the fidelity of that information, can help you do this thing better. Yeah. So given a problem and my mental representation of it, intelligence might be how well I can reduce the error based on what I think the world should operate and the predictions I make from that and what actually happens. And we do that at an individual level. Our brains do that, but so do these evolutionary systems. So that's what culture is doing. By selecting, it's a much more general way to represent it is using a logistic function where I'm reducing this error and storing the information culturally, and I'm reducing the error and storing that information over genes, literally based on the amount of variation in the population. So no, I don't think that. I mean, I don't know what intelligence is, and whenever you're trying to get down to the to its core elements, it starts to get slipperier and slipperier. There are all kinds of things that go into solving these problems, but many of them are delivered via our cultural systems, and many of them are delivered. So I think, remember when I started, I said, sometimes what it takes for science to move forward is to let go of assumptions. And I think one of those assumptions is the nature of human intelligence, whatever it might be. In other sciences, the examples are, it's pretty clear that we live on a flat Earth with a sun going around. I mean, that looks pretty clear to us. Let go of that assumption and you can get a better model of the solar system. I think letting go of this assumption that there is this intrinsic intelligence that is in us, in our heads, and it varies systematically, and then it manifests out there in the world, rather than this kind of interplay between what is us, what the environment looks like, can get you a better model of humans.
That's a nice way to put it. All right. So there's a nice question here about, does the internet enhance and augment human intelligence? What is your opinion about that?
I think that overall that it does. We worry a lot about things like fake news, for example. So in kind of our work on the collective brain, there are these levers of cultural complexity and innovation, right? One of them is kind of transmission, like how well I can transmit information. The other is kind of this paradox of diversity, how much diversity, which has this double effect. You can ask me about that. And the other is sociality, the size and interconnectedness of our societies. The internet has vastly increased the size and interconnectedness of our society. So when we worry about fake news, what we're really seeing is all of the things that we normally did happening a lot faster. The coffee shops kind of led to this kind of enlightenment as like thinkers came together, and ideas, as Matt Ridley puts it, had sex with each other. Ideas were able to flow and meet in our social networks, recombining into brand new things. Twitter, we are annoyed because we see things that we disagree with, that makes us so angry, we carry on, but it's allowing everything to happen a lot faster and exposing us to ideas that we wouldn't have. I see psychologists borrowing from economists, and now, talking to epidemiologists, and big battles going on. So when it comes to fake news, the real solutions are moving just as fast. I mean, as children, in the 90s, we held all kinds of weird ideas. Carrots help you see in the dark, or, whatever. We had all kinds of fake news that didn't get dispelled for a very long time. Today, fake news spreads, and so does the real answer. Everything just happens faster. So I think, yes, it is making us brighter. But I want to say something else about, I just want to say something else about that. So it is making us brighter as a whole, but our intelligence has become kind of diffused now. So as a society, we can do all kinds of amazing things, but as individuals, we might actually be stupider in some sense, right? For two reasons. One is that, if you look at the model of the cultural brain hypothesis, when you transition from asocial learning to social learning, we predict a decrease in brain size and then a takeoff again. And that's because social learning, like copying the right answer, is easier than figuring it out on your own. You don't need as big a brain to do that. We let many people survive. That's the first thing. The second is that because we now specialize so deeply, right? We are relative idiots to a whole bunch of other things. Like you don't know how to fix your car. You don't know how, the internet works. You stay in your lane on this tiny thing. Yes, as a society, because I'm using my 10 size brain in this very narrow way, we're all better off, and together we can, we probably now have tools for thinking about climate change, right? But as chatting with Helen recently, as she put it, if Helen Davis, sorry, if we might be well equipped to deal with climate change, but if in a post-climate change world, if it really got as apocalyptic as as some people say, we might have been better off as hunter-gatherers, where we knew how to do everything. If we were taken out of our element and thrown out into the wilderness, even camping, I don't know how well you'd survive, despite your PhDs.
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting to think about this. I guess recombining ideas though doesn't always mean that you're making better ideas, right? You might make them dumber, if anything, and maybe the steady state of having all those ideas may kill the complexity in there. So what you
Yeah,
had that was very
yeah,
important for Copernicus time, when a lot of people had their own ideas but went for it, and Copernicus somehow won the lottery. Can we have this now when ideas are very mixed on Twitter? Maybe you still have it. If so, I guess
yeah.
there is a right algorithm to combine those ideas together, and I'm
Right,
not
right, right.
sure. I'm not
So
sure
the
you get it for
model,
free.
yeah. So the
Mhm.
models actually predict a kind of a bell-shaped curve on innovation and connectedness.
Is that
So
the
if we're like,
reverse Flynn effect?
sorry.
Is that the reverse Flynn effect? I
No, no,
remember
no. So
reading
this is
about
just like if you're designing a
it.
group, right, or a society as humans are, then the relatedness that we would predict on how interconnected that group is because of our conformist biases, our tendency to copy one another, we'll take this kind of bell-shaped curve. Why? If we're completely disconnected, we're thinking on our own. That sucks. But if we're all fully connected, there's a lot of groupthink. Let's say, we're all copying one another, and so you're right. You get this loss of cognitive of diversity. Um, so there's this kind of optimal level that matters a lot in small groups, right? The famous kind of brainstorming task works better if you get people to go off, do their own thing, or go off in small groups and do it, and then come back together. There's some nice experiments that have been done that look at partial connectivity as this is Max Derrick's work as leading to higher innovation. But I would say that for us, despite the internet, we are nowhere near the mean of connectedness. Like I barely know the people in my neighborhood, right? Like I know my neighbors and my immediate, but I don't know beyond. When I'm working in the office, I don't know anyone else in the building. So our connectedness is so low at the moment that pushing hard on that is where we need to be for now. If we reach a singularity, then we can talk about the other side of that curve.
All right, so we have a question from Nils. Yeah, by the way, anyone feel free to push a question also to upvote or ask your own. And if anyone wants to participate here also in the room, that's fine too. So why does it not make sense to compare mean IQ scores between country societies, or can it make sense after all? Thanks for the interesting talk.
Well, thank you for coming, Nils.
And I guess there is a bit like that is left. This question is motivated by the recently redacted Clark, I guess,
right.
Clark et al. 2020.
Right. I mean, I haven't looked too deeply into the Clark et al. Paper. It seems like there's other issues with how those measurements are done. In principle, I think if you're able to run the same test, in different societies, you would get an answer as to how people behave on that test. I think the issue comes in how you interpret that answer. Insofar as you think that performance in that IQ test. So I think part of the issue is, again, we have this view that there's this inside of us intelligence, and it is exogenous somehow. And smarter, countries, people with smarter IQs have greater development. But I'd say actually, it's according to a cultural evolutionary perspective, it's the other way around. So a country, or at least it's kind of a circular thing, where countries that invest in education increase IQ, which in turn can, aid development, right? So you're measuring something, but what does it mean given that people are operating in a very different world to what that IQ test is designed? We designed those tests. They're operating in a very different world, potentially, depending on who you measure, than what those tests are designed to get at. And so insofar as you think that that's the pathway to success, then you want people to be doing better at that. And there are probably hardware and software components, this is what's controversial, I think, that go into how people are performing on that. If they're in a very diseasey environment, even in our society, if you're suffering from, if you're dealing with poverty, you're not able to kind of take a long-term view on the world, whatever. You don't have enough food, you're not going to perform, right, as well. So that's the hardware side of things. And then there's the software side of things, like how good is your education system? How is it delivering this stuff? How much of it have you received? How valued is it in your society? Are your parents educated? Are those around you educated? There's so many other factors. So I don't think the issue is in the theoretical way in which IQ tests are performed and then compared. That's the issue.
Thank you.
No problem.
Yeah, I hear. Right. Yeah, let me switch.
I haven't even talked about the trade-off on diversity and innovation.
Yeah. I see two questions from Anne. So yeah, somehow question 2 is upvoted, so we can start with question 2. So do you think? Well, I see. So it's not a follow-up. It's half a follow-up question. So let's start with question 1 then. Is language the most important factor that makes human as human in perspective of today's topic? And do you think AI will evolve by themselves from a certain point, because AI would have language and information can be stored and AI can communicate?
Yeah. So I think it's a mistake to try to say what is the most important feature in this way, because the system has co-evolved. It has moved together. Language is kind of useless unless you have something that's worth communicating. There has to be something that is, that you need to communicate with this wonderful and recombinable language. So yes, language has been tremendously useful, and it sits there with all kinds of other things that allow for very high throughput communication between people. But I favor Olaf and I were just talking about this before this, a Baldwinian approach to the evolution of language. If you imagine, what, here's the story that I think it fits nicely. For whatever reason, we become bipedal. It frees up our hands. This does two things. One is that it makes tools cheaper. So I can now invest more in, sharpening that axe, that stone axe, let's say, because I don't have to drop it because I'm, quadrupedal. I can instead carry it with me when I go. The second thing that does is it frees up my hands for gestural communication, which we still do. I'm doing it right now, in addition to any kind of guttural utterances. This can support, under certain conditions, a buildup of cultural information, which in turn can select for innovations, for genetic innovations in language, right? And so when you get things like FoxP2 come along, they're right, because we actually do have some cool things that need to be transmitted. And so this Baldwinian process, what was formally learned, it takes a long time to learn what symbols mean what. Any genes that can help you do that faster are selected. And so you start to see the architecture of language start to emerge in our species. If we might be seeing a similar kind of thing with reading today, where it's become ubiquitous, it is in our brains, and people who can be better at it might have an advantage over others. So to say, is language the most important thing to human intelligence, is a bit like saying, are the tires or is the carburetor the most important thing in a car? Forgive my car analogy. In any system, the pieces all fit together. And yes, language can be understood as one component of that, as can all of the other ways that we transmit information.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, AI. Do you think AI will evolve by themselves from a certain point because AI would have language information? This is just pure speculation, and I am not the right expert to be asking this question. In fact, I would say Olaf is probably better posed, but I mean, I think yes. I mean, I think that AI will begin to evolve at some point. It has access. If it has greater capacity than we do, it has access to all of our information, and if it's augmented by us, the world that I guess is that we will work in coordination with our machines. In the same way that we do now. I mean, like in my lifetime, have lost the ability to store a whole bunch of things. I remember my childhood phone number and nothing else, no other phone numbers. And I don't remember what I'm going to do after this. I do, but mostly I forget because my calendar does it for me. So already I'm distributing my cognition and I'm distributing my memory. So I think we'll see more of that, where I'm going to distribute more of that real cognitive element.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
So I guess, I guess the AI could. So of course, in the future, if AI is closer to what a human being is, or they combine with humans, that would form evidently some kind of culture. But also, if you just imagine an AI constructed with several timescales or several, those levels of where you can store memory in a different way, with different properties, then you would have similar property to cultural evolution. And I guess that, yeah, that's one way to have it, a society of AI without going so much in the future yet. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll briefly say I actually have one paper on genetic algorithms, which you guys can look up. It was taking a different approach, but I was fascinated by whether we can use insights from cultural evolution, in these algorithms themselves. My take home is that, like, in many ways, cultural evolution is because of the limitations of our physicality. So I'm not sure how useful that might be, but maybe. I'd love to chat more about that, Olaf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are exciting topics that are tackled actually together in a community. It's called the Artificial Life. So there was just a conference last week on the topic. So you have people talking about GA, and the next minute they're talking about cultural evolution or language evolution. Very interesting. All right, so Take, I guess, asked a question about, you started by mentioning that animals and humans may not be that different hardware-wise. What do you think is the difference between human and animal culture?
Oh, I see. So let me clarify. I said that the gap between us and chimps may not be as large as you might assume in this kind of raw processing. And my read on the evidence is that we look a lot like scaled up primate brains. So given that we are primates, that imposes things on our cognition. So, let's say language. It could be that, we almost certainly do have kind of neural, let's say, changes that allow us to quickly absorb language, some kind of acquisition device. But that may be actually shaped by our phylogeny, the fact that we are scaled up last common ancestor with chimps. So I'm not saying that all animal brains look the same. Across the animal kingdom, within similar taxa, you can compare brains and look at how, for example, larger brains can store and manage more information. But there's a big difference between a bee brain and a human brain. The difference between human and animal culture. So in the cultural brain hypothesis, we look at what leads to that kind of takeoff. And one of the things that emerge, I mean, it's probably not the only way this can happen, is that it requires this kind of high fidelity transmission. But that high fidelity transmission only makes sense when actually there's a lot to transmit, where you need to ape without, like, you need to copy without really understanding. And that requires, for a smart early ancestor, there should be a lot of stuff that actually is worth, humans are like the kid in class who cheats. Somebody else, our ancestor, worked out all this stuff, and then we just came in and stole it by just, learning how to do it without learning how it was done. So I think that's a big part of it. Now, why humans? What was it about our lineage that led to this? Was it a founder effect, like one smart proto-human? Was it the fact that we were bipedal and we had appendages that can manipulate objects, and we were bipedal, which means lowered the cost of tools? I don't know. It's an open question, but that is empirically what the difference is. Why that difference emerges? Whether given sufficient time, another animal will reach, we'll have a cultural line of inheritance of the kind that we have. I don't know. I can speculate.
So maybe let's take one last question before we switch to phase 3, which is just open-ended discussion mode for everyone here, and we'll stop the stream at that point. So thank you in advance for everyone for joining, and we can continue answering questions. This is fun. So don't miss the announcement. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to know about the next month event. Sometimes we have more than one a month. So subscribe on the YouTube, or just go on crosslabs.org and subscribe to our newsletter or anything. Follow us on Twitter, those kind of things. Okay, so last question was from Mathieu. You said that intelligence is, I guess there are two parts to this. Yeah, you said that intelligence is the capacity for predicting our environment and reducing errors. How does this relate to the notion of intelligence as general problem solving? And part 2 is how do the two notions of intelligence relate to the collective brain? All right, so that's a big question.
So I'll answer the first one. I'm not sure what you mean by the two notions of intelligence, so I'm going to have you clarify that in a second. So the first is, I don't think it necessarily means that it doesn't necessarily imply that we have general problem solving and that there is no kind of specialization to the kinds of problems that we think about, or the biases in how we think, or anything like that. I just mean that in general, any animal that simulates their world and can learning as a kind of error reduction on that simulation, that is intelligence. That is what the intelligence difference is as a kind of speculative thing. But it wouldn't necessarily be general, right? The kind of world, the kind of error reduction that a bee engages in, or the kind of error reduction that a chimp might engage in, and the kind of error reduction that we do are not the same at all. And they're, I'm not looking for flowers. I'm not tracking colors. I don't necessarily have that. Can I apply my intelligence to a wide array of things? It seems like I can. It seems like, but when I do that, I often augment my thinking with these externalized systems. So, I can understand the quantum mechanical world because I can write, I can't personally, but, humans can understand the quantum mechanical world because we can write down equations about it. And so we externalize that, and so we augment our thinking in that way. And I think that reveals that it's not so general that it can learn anything, but it can with some help of the tools that we build. I don't understand. I'm not sure what you mean by the two notions of intelligence.
I think maybe the second part we can keep discussing now in the second, in the third part of the discussion. But Michael, thank you so much for joining us for a lovely presentation and a very different view on intelligence. It's the first time we talk about cultural intelligence in this series, believe it or not.
Thank you for having me, Olaf. This was a lot of fun.
Real pleasure. Yeah, thank you. And for everyone here, we can also sign language clap, and let's get together again next month. Please don't forget to hit subscribe if you want to receive notifications about this. And that's a good point to end the stream, and let's keep discussing.